wrestle, 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 hard, wrestle, 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 hard, wrestle, 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 hard.
And welcome back to Meeting of the Minds with Wrestling Mindset. Today I'm here with two other great Penn alumni, the great Ben Hatta and Yoshi Nakamura. Welcome, guys. How's it going?
Good. How are you, man?
Good, thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent. So I've been diving deeply into the history of Japanese wrestling as well as judo. So who better to have on the show? Two successful wrestlers, background in judo, and wealth of knowledge and experience. So
yeah, thank you. What got you interested in that combo of wrestling and judo? Why'd you start digging into that?
So I've always been interested. I mean, knowing the background, knowing Yoshi with judo, hearing about some other guys, Mako with judo, many people. So I said, there's got to be some connection here. And I was actually looking up Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and learning about the origins there, and hearing that Penn, he was basically sitting at the top, who's started judo, and then one of his students, Tomita, then Maeda, and Maeda taught Carlos Gracie Sr. And I said, wait a minute, I bet you there's a connection with Japanese wrestling. Sure enough, your grandfather, Ichiro Hatta, and there it is.
That's great. I mean, the sport, I think Yoshi was way better at than I ever was. And, but it taught me a lot. And I think both of us did judo before we even started wrestling. So It gave us that foundation, just body knowledge and movement and, self-defense and fighting from a defensive position. So yeah, it was very instrumental in core and sort of our background.
Yeah, there's a thing about balance in judo that you learn, body control, that you'll see a lot of judo players that wrestle. They'll be in these weird funky positions, and they're able to kind of torque and turn their body in ways that I think a traditional wrestler might not quite understand. There have been plenty of athletes that have wrestled but then taken judo to round out their skills. Dave Schultz being one of the main guys, one of the best athletes that we've had in the history of wrestling. But he had this deep belief in Japanese martial arts. I think Book of Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi, a famous samurai, was a kind of an icon of his. But he incorporated that into his judo, into his wrestling. But there's been plenty of ties in that. And actually, Ben's dad, Coach Tadaki Hatta, who's one of the greatest Olympic coaches we've had in the United States, actually coached Dave Schultz. So there was a lot. Oh, there it is. There it is.
The old handbook.
So yeah, a lot of ties.
Awesome. Talk about your family history together. You guys go back. Your ancestry goes back some ways now.
Yeah, I'll defer to my elder here.
I mean, obviously, it starts with my grandfather. He came over in late 1929 with a judo team to compete against a bunch of wrestlers in the United States. And they did well, but then they got beat up when they started to get on the mat and grapple. And so he started taking notes about the holds they were doing and using, and then came back to Japan, and I had to incorporate that sort of in judo. And they were like, no, we don't use those moves, but if you want to go out and start your own sport, then go for it. And so he started Japanese wrestling at that point. And then I think the war put a lot of stuff on hold in the 40s. And then when he came back to Japan, I think he jumped right back into it. And he was coaching the Olympics, the Japanese team, for a while. And then he started importing Japanese wrestlers in the 50s and 60s back to the US to compete in college wrestling. And so that's how my uncle ended up here. My dad ended up here, and a whole bunch of other wrestlers ended up here. So I was probably in the 60s. But then Yoshi's dad, I think, came over in the 70s or in the late 60s, but he was in Japan pretty much the whole time before that.
That's right. Actually, the interlink here is, so Ben's grandfather was literally the right-hand man of the founder of judo, Dr. Jigoro Kano. And so my father was actually born in 1930. He was born into a military family, and as a teenager in the Junior Naval Academy, there were certain members of that organization that were trained as kamikaze pilots. My dad was actually in that category at 13 years old. So when you think about the mental stress that comes along with a lot of that, but at the same time, they use martial arts to to discipline them mentally and physically throughout that period of time. Well, my dad fell in love with judo. It was just something that, he was just all in on. It was like a religion to him. And so as the war ended, as Ben mentioned, what was very interesting is the overlap comes around the 1964 Olympic team. And that was, my dad had been in training in the Kodokan, and unfortunately he had a few injuries that precluded him from the All Japan Championships, prevented him from competing in the All Japan Championships and really taking a shot at the Olympics. But he ended up coaching the lightweights in the 1964 Olympics, and that was the first time judo was introduced into the Olympics in 1964. So big kudos to Ben's grandfather as a driver of that. But that's where things started to overlap a little bit. Our story gets even wilder when you think about 30, 40 years later. But, my dad came to the United States in the late 60s, early 70s, he coached around the world judo, taught judo in Egypt, the military and the Egyptian national team. He taught, in Central and South America. There's some, I'm sure as Ben's grandfather has and dad has, some very random pictures of things like my father training like Manuel Noriega. I mean, just wild times and wild pictures and wild history of judo and the path that he took to get here.
Yeah, and then I think in the 70s, Yoshi's dad was in Ohio around that time, in Elyria, and my dad had just got his first job in Oberlin, Ohio. And I was talking to him yesterday, asking him how they first met, and he said that he was teaching at the public high school, and there was a Japanese kid in the high school whose family was Japanese, and he was taking judo. And so he mentioned, hey, there's this, sensei who's got the school down the street, about 10 minutes away. You should check it out. And when he went there, he realized that it was Ryozo, and they just started talking, and they realized that my grandfather had, worked with Ryozo, and they were both coaches in the 64 Olympics together. And so my dad just started coaching at Yoshi's dad's school. And that was in 78, I think he said. And then we started probably 6 years old. So that would have been 82. So that's when I started taking judo. And we started judo first. We didn't do wrestling until 8th grade. And so that's when I met Yoshi. He was little kid in all in his judo gi. And, I remember they used to have this punching bag in the middle of, because half the school I think was like a dance studio or
karate studio, right? Was this at Jackson?
Yeah. Yeah. And then the back was the judo school. Yeah. But they had a bunch of boxing heavy bags. And I remember Yoshi would run around, and my brother and I would try to knock him over with these big bags swinging. And then we get yelled at for goofing around.
Yeah, we were supposed to be in the front where the karate studio was, but obviously the big brother's leading me into the danger there.
Yeah, so we all started judo, probably around the same age, but Yoshi was just more entrenched in it. So he was getting it, 5-6 times a day or a week, and we were getting it twice a week. But that's what we did up until wrestling, besides soccer. And then that's how we ended up at St. Ed's.
Yeah, it's quite random when you think about the powers to be and how that all converged into Lorain County. Coach Jane, Frank Jane, Eddie and Mark Jane actually took judo as well around the same time. And Coach Jane used to always call it the Lorain County connection when we all eventually went to St. Ed's. But it is weird, and I do believe that there's a higher power that brings good people back together for a purpose. And we've talked about my father passing on a couple of previous interviews, but Ben and his family were just crucial and vital to my development and my family's development to success. He was the leader for me who went to St. Ed's. My first day when I walked in, Ben was I was Ben's shadow to walk around and shadow the school. He took me to my first practice, and mind you, now I started wrestling really in high school. I tried wrestling, I think it was like maybe in like the 5th or 6th grade. I can't even remember exactly when it was. And I hated it. And I went through like half the season, and I was like, I got to stick to judo and baseball and other sports. But, I really didn't get into wrestling until high school. And, it was a testament to one, the judo background, but two, I had one of the best big brothers to follow, and that was Ben Hatta.
The time is now to take your mindset to the next level with Wrestling Mindset. Make sure you go to our website, wrestlingmindset.com, and sign up for your free trial session today. Don't wait any longer. You want the mental edge right now. When you sign up for the free trial session, you're also going to get a copy of our free ebook, Building the Predator Mindset. This book has helped thousands of people build confidence, relax under pressure, get motivated, and build mental toughness in wrestling, school, and life. Make sure you sign up for your free trial session today. That's awesome. That's awesome. And then talk about then how, so then Ben went to Penn first, and then you followed him there too.
Yeah, well, first, let me stop there because, to gloss over the, Ben's high school career, because remember, Ben and Robert didn't start till a little later, but Ben is like a hero to me because he had one of the most epic state championship runs I've ever seen in the history of St. Ed's wrestling. He had battled a lot of tough competition throughout the year. I mean, some amazing studs, and one in Adam Plaus, who was a stud from Walsh Jesuit. But as a freshman, I got to get my butt kicked by Ben Hatta, Eddie Jane, Brad Clement every day in the wrestling room. But as a freshman, I'm watching Ben just climb this ladder. And when you think about what St. Ed's wrestling has done, for a lot of the athletes, including me, including Ben, is that it's built, champions. And sometimes you build them in a couple of years, sometimes you build them the first year, but sometimes it takes all the way to that last year. And to me, Ben is a hero. Watching him climb that ladder and just beat top opponent after top opponent at the state championships. I mean, I get goosebumps even just telling that story. I get so fired up. But he went to Penn, joining one of the up and coming Ivy League teams. And Coach Rain at the time had this kind of vision of having the best combination of athletics and academics. And no better student athlete to come from any high school than a St. Edward wrestler. And Ben was the leader in that. And after I saw his success, then I followed him to Penn. And I think Greg Hallahan, Mason Lenhart, we've had others. And actually, now that Coach is back, we've rekindled that St. Ed's University of Pennsylvania pipeline. So I'm excited about that.
Nice. We all are.
I mean, to go back to some of what Yoshi talked about, I think it's probably my brother was the first of us to go through the process of, starting in judo, not having any wrestling background besides just being around it, and then going through the St. Ed system. And that's really where it all started. They can take someone like me, Yoshi, my brother, Zach Thompson, someone who's never wrestled before, wrestled 1 year in eighth grade, and then put them through kind of this Army style boot camp, where you start out as a plebe, and then you get your ass kicked, and then you work your way up through the system. And then by the time you're a senior, hopefully you've, stuck around. And, but the competition that you're facing all the time is just, the best in the nation. So that was really the grinding stone, I think, for all of us, that sort of took our basic skill set of body knowledge and balance and awareness and leverage, but gave us the skills of wrestling and the technique and the cardio and the sort of the grit to take all that stuff and actually become a really good wrestler. But Yoshi took that formula, and he's got just natural ability then, more than the rest of us. And so he was able to do it in 2 years. I mean, it was interesting to see and to talk about when I was at St. Ed or at Penn with the guys there, that there's this kid that wrestled for a year and a half, 2 years, and he's a state champ. And then he's going to be another state champ, So, but before me going to Penn, there was a guy, Pat Johnson, who was, I think he was a third placer that wrestled at St. Ed's. And he was, I think, 4 years older than me. I think he was a senior when I got to, or maybe he was graduating when I got to Penn. But he was the first, I think, Penn wrestler or Ed's wrestler that went to Penn. But what really drew us to Penn was Foxcatcher. Foxcatcher was the catalyst that brought Slay and the Modders and basically everyone that from that 92 to 96. Anyone that was going to Penn was going there because of Dave Schultz and Foxcatcher and what that offered. I mean, all of our coaches were Foxcatcher guys. Shade and Dolph and Trevor Lewis all lived on the farm. So that was really, it was the combination of going to an Ivy League school. They were up and coming, they were, I think 25th or 24th when I was a freshman. And I think they got up to like 9th, maybe by the time I left, or by the time Yoshi was there, they were like 9th in the nation. So that was also a fun sort of thing to see what Roger was doing, sort of building, I wouldn't call it a dynasty, but it was a little bit of a mini force there for about 4 or 5 years,
What's interesting about that, what Ben's mentioning too, is think about what's happening today, right? This forward thinking of like bringing regional training centers onto campus, and associating that with the university and creating more funding around that. That what Penn had early on was that with Foxcatcher being so close. You get guys like Dave Schultz contributing. You get guys like Dan Shea, Brian Dolph. I mean, these guys are awesome, unbelievable wrestlers, but they're there every day. Now you have at Penn, you have Jordan Burroughs, you got Mark Hall, you got Slay, it's just unbelievable talent coming back to University of Pennsylvania, which, to me is, when I talk to some of the St. Ed's kids that are asking questions about going to Penn, you just mentioned Jordan Burroughs, you mentioned Brandon Slay, you got 2 Olympic gold medalists right there. It's pretty good.
Absolutely. It's great stuff. And really interesting. Talk about a little bit how your background, Japanese culture, as well as judo background, how that prepared you physically, technically, mentally for wrestling. And basically, when if you're starting with young kids, do you have them get involved in judo? At what age? How should they be approaching that?
Yeah, that's a super. I think that's a great question. There's a judo school, Chutobu Rasa, which is run by Paul Jordan here in Ohio, in the Avon area. And he recruits and brings in a lot of wrestlers, and a lot of young. He actually has one of the biggest youth programs for judo out there. I think getting your kid into judo before you get him into wrestling and even any other sport is again, it's so important for learning the body and body control. I think the only other sport that I probably would say all kids should get into is gymnastics. I mean, my 2 daughters do gymnastics now. I put wrestling shoes on them and put them on the mat, and I could tell them what to do, and they could easily mimic it because they had body control and they could, move and torque their body in a way at which I was describing them to do it. So to me, judo especially is one of those types of sports.
I like one, it's fun to see because a lot of my friends are getting their kids, guys that never wrestled in high school, they're football and baseball players and basketball players, are getting their kids into jujitsu, and which is translating into them when they get to high school becoming wrestlers in high school, because there is no jujitsu sort of program once you get to high school. It's just sort of club stuff. But either one of those sports, either any martial art where there's physical contact and body awareness, I think is a good basis to start with, even before wrestling, because what those disciplines teach is actually discipline. There's a respect. I think that's one thing that the martial arts sort of taught both Yoshi and I and a lot of others is a deep respect for the actual sport and looking at it more in technique versus just going, aggressively at somebody. You've got to learn a move. And there's sort of an actual list of moves that you have to learn before you qualify for the next belt color. And you have to display those, in front of everyone to show that you've mastered them. So there is sort of a schooling, and, Yoshi will let you know right away, his dad was a disciplinarian. I'm sure my grandfather was a disciplinarian, and they didn't take shit. And you go into a wrestling room and kids are just kind of running around and doing all those things. Not in a martial arts school. They're sitting folded, they've got their gis tightened, they're listening, and all the direction is sort of coming from the front, and there's a lot of focus there. So I would give that a little bit more, like let those kids sort of learn that the actual discipline that comes from a sport or a martial art, and then learning body control at the same time. And you can do both, simultaneously, but I think the difference between wrestling and judo or jujitsu is that besides the on the mat and rolling around, is it teaches that actual discipline and respect, and there's an order and a way of things that wrestling doesn't necessarily. You can find it and you'll learn it in wrestling later on, but I don't think they're necessarily like form and function right off the bat. And the very first thing you learn in judo is how to take a fall, how to actually prepare yourself when you hit the mat so you don't hurt yourself. And that is huge, that kids don't necessarily know at a young age when they're just wrestling and they get double legged and they just go flat to the mat and they, get concussed, or, and I mean, the core that I went to when it became sort of like a street fight, when you first started wrestling as a kid, you're like, yeah, I know a single leg, I know a double leg, but my core go-to moves were always judo moves. And even when I got taken down, it was always like a break fall or something like that. I think that gave us a good foundation of a lot of things that came, I think, later for other people.
Speaking of which, if you ever get back to any of Ben's matches against Adam Klaus, man, Ben had a wicked headlock that was pretty much a judo throw. And man, dude, he laid that down hard. But I go ahead.
I was going to say, that's another thing that you don't necessarily learn right away as a kid, is a 5-point move. And that's your lifeline when you're losing, is anytime you're down, you can pull this one move out of your pocket. Yep. And if you're good at it, you can hit it anytime. Whereas when you're a kid, sometimes you don't have that, skill set yet. So that helped a lot.
Ben mentions two things that I think, in many cases, I think I look at the world right now and seems to be quite missing, is respect. So when you think about walking into a judo school, you take shoes off, you bow on the mat, right? You go get changed, right? You bow off the mat, you go get changed, come back, you bow onto the mat, you get lined up, gi straight, everything's tightened up. And that discipline, along with the respect of the judo school, respect for the sensei, respect for your peers, is so important. I remember walking into the St. Ed's wrestling room and just feeling that level of respect when we were there, right? I mean, you didn't show disrespect to the coaches, you didn't show disrespect to your teammates, especially the older ones, because guess what? You are absolutely going to get pounded if that happens. I mean, think about that, right?
We had a uniform too that we had to wear. We had the
black
gray sweats, gray shirts, and the black shorts that everyone had to wear.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting.
So important. And by the way, like Ben said, my parents carried that at home too. So my dad was quite heavy-handed, in discipline. He was an 8th degree black belt. But keep in mind, my mom was also, good old Irish English lady from Rhode Island, was a 4th degree black belt in judo. So we didn't mess around at home. If we did, it was a problem. It was a real problem for us. So we had to stay disciplined both at home and at school and at judo.
Awesome. Then talk about, I guess, bring it all together where your judo background, your wrestling background, your Penn background. How have you brought that all together into your careers now? And then also, what current projects are you guys involved in?
Sure, Ben.
I mean, all of that wrestling and judo, once you get to a higher level in wrestling, it all equals out in a sense of the martial art, the mental training, that sort of warrior mentality. A lot of that came from the St. Ed's sort of family of, they were always expecting to win, and the big crowds that we drew, and the teams that we competed against. And then when we went to Penn, it was kind of like starting over. It was like getting on a thing that was sort of trying to build. And that was a whole new experience, and a great ride to be a part of. I felt two different sort of environments of going into a machine that was always doing well, and then being a part of something that wanted to be that and achieved it. And then getting out into sort of the real world and finding my career. It was sort of the same thing. I always expected to be where the best are and challenge myself, and being part of Penn too. You realize that, I was a good student, but I was nowhere near as good student that were represented at Penn. I was probably a dummy at Penn compared to what was there, and I felt it sometimes too, even though I got decent grades. But that pushed me when I got out into the real world, and I realized that there's no few that have worked hard or pushed themselves the way that we have from high school to college, and now using that energy and that focus and that mindset into a career. It sort of I wouldn't say easy, but you realize that other people hadn't worked that hard as you had. And so you got recognized more for your work. I think it just propelled me. And even today, you know, working on the projects I'm working on, you know, I'm my own boss, so I've got to push myself. And so it's getting up every day. It's, you know, finding that routine and that same mental, you know, drive to continue to move forward and succeed at the highest possible, you know, level I can. So
for me, it was, you know, my father always taught me that you got to be a student of your sport, student of your environment, you know, student of life. And, you know, carrying that discipline was super important. So, you know, when my father passed away, again, I talk about karma and kind of good karma coming together and the forces to be. But I mean, Ben's family was 15 minutes, 20 minutes away from where we lived, right? And because, you know, Coach Hatta was at my father's bedside, you know, when he was dying, and said, you know, I'll look after your family. You know, we'll make sure that they stay on the right path. That's a big deal. That's a big responsibility, you know. And as a 13-year-old kid, you know, I'm just very fortunate to have, you know, what I had. But that discipline up until I was 13, like that was ingrained in my blood. You know, the respect, the discipline, and then, you know, understanding technique. And I think, you know, Ben had mentioned that earlier. You know, when you understand the fundamentals of technique, you can apply that step function or learning process to anything, right? So I applied that to wrestling, right? And I think what wrestling brought was the physicality. You know, it's interesting. I caught the Ben Askren, Joe Rogan podcast interview, and, you know, they gave you guys a big shout out, which, you know, I wish more people would hear about wrestling mindset, and I'm sure they will. But, you know, Joe Rogan hits the nail on the head. When you've been through a wrestling training program and discipline like that, that physicality, that mental toughness, that warrior mentality is just ingrained in you as well. So I had that judo part of me built in my DNA, and then I incorporated wrestling into my DNA. I wasn't as good a student as Ben, but I was a pretty good student. But yeah, when I got to, you know, through the wrestling program at St. Ed's and pulled down a couple of state championships and had the opportunity to go to Ivy League schools, you know, getting into Penn wasn't necessarily easy. And, you know, I specifically applied to the Wharton School of Business, which is even harder to get into. You know, you got to study your SAT prep program. You have to work hard. I had extra tutors to help me get through that stuff. But what I realized is when I got to Penn is that, you know, it's still competitive, and I agree with Penn. There's definitely a lot smarter people than I was there. But you know what I learned after I got out is there are a lot of people that are born on third base and they think they hit a triple. And I'll work out. I've been through some really gnarly economic environments, especially working on Wall Street. And I'll roll my sleeves up every day and I'll work every single person. And that is not a question. That's going through the 2007, 2008, 2009 financial housing crisis. That's going through, you know, COVID. Anytime I've ever been in that situation, outworking your opponents has always been the key. Outworking them, never giving up, being just stubborn about quitting. And, you know, maybe that's my downfall in life, because sometimes I just feel like I haven't lost. I just, you know, still fighting for it. But what I realized is that with those basic tools, I've been able to reinvent myself a number of times. You know, I went from a judo guy to a wrestler to an Ivy League school, you know, to working on Wall Street, to then launching the first cryptocurrency merchant bank in the world. And then now I own a bunch of fried chicken businesses. You know, if you think about the
Bojangles.
Bojangles, seriously, it's one of the best fried chicken brands out there. But think about it, right? All of the things incorporate the very same discipline that you need to have. And by the way, guess what? All of those things come along with surrounding yourself with amazing people. My whole life, I've been fortunate to be surrounded by amazing people. I was surrounded by good friends and family growing up. I was surrounded by amazing guys in the wrestling room. I was surrounded by quotes that were hanging on the wall, you know, from The Edge, from Howard Ferguson. The legacy of the foundation that was built, that laid all of that goodness ahead of me, was there, right then for me to take advantage of and embrace, and so on and so forth. And it's been that way my whole career. And still today, you know, when I have a hard time, who do I call? I call my mom, and then I call Ben. And Ben reminds me that, you know, sometimes you got to, you know, put your nose to the grindstone like we did when we were wrestling together. And sometimes you got to put your headphones in your ears and go for a walk and take a deep breath. Ben, I don't know if you remember telling me that, but when I was 10, you know, I was at the peak of my career and I was at the peak of my career on Wall Street working at Citi and having the toughest time mentally pushing through. And, you know, Ben reminded me, sometimes you just got to go for a walk, get away. Just, you know, instead of riding a cab, just walk a couple of miles, you know, if you have to. So
Awesome. Awesome, guys. This has been a ton of fun, very informative. Let's Ben, tell us a little bit about your films that you have and how we could support you and what you do. Obviously doing great things for the wrestling community, as both of you guys do. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of documentaries, but one is sort of my third sort of wrestling based doc. We did Team Foxcatcher, which was on Netflix. We did Kurt Angle's documentary, which was on A&E and the WWE. And now I'm working on my third one, which is based on the 90s high school rivalry between St. Ed's and Walsh Jesuit, where those two schools sort of battled for, number 1 and 2 in the nation for about 10 years in a row until Blair came along. So I'm working on that, and that'll be out hopefully by the end of the year. Anyone wants to support, you can reach out. You can find me on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. But we're always looking for investors in all of our projects. And then I'm working, Jeremy Baylor and I, one of my roommate from Penn, we're working with Ryan Warner, the host of Wrestling Changed My Life, on a couple projects that we hope to have out in a year or so. But yeah, it's just, I'm trying to get good wrestling stories made and told and done in a high quality and a good story, broad story sort of telling manner. So you're bringing in more of an audience than just wrestlers. You're bringing in the outside people who are curious to hear a human element story. And so I'm just trying to focus what I've done in the last 25 years of my career, sort of honing in on some stories that I enjoy that are from my past and involve the sport of wrestling. So yeah, and also to capitalize on some of the things that Yoshi said too about it's not just the men, the physical, I can outwork everyone and I can do all this, but there is, and it's probably goes to your mindset school, is there are those things that Howard Ferguson taught us. There's the book The Edge that we grew up on that would feed us with quotes, and I have a copy of it and I read it every day to keep a certain mindset, and I meditate every day, and it's helped especially through the pandemic. But you have to have a balanced mind and body and spirit, and in order to achieve, I think, what you want to accomplish in life. And so, yeah, no matter how hard you're working or how stubborn you are, if I can do all this, there's always that aspect of your mind that you need to sort of refresh and keep focused as well, and sort of balance that out.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, actually it was great. We had the National High School Wrestling Championships down in Virginia Beach, where I own the stores in Virginia Beach for Bojangles, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Suffolk. So we had a lot of wrestlers coming through having fried chicken after the weigh-in. So I think there was only one weigh-in too, which is kind of nice. So actually, we sponsored St. Ed's came down and we sponsored the team dinner both nights. So those guys actually perform well. So maybe people need a little more fried chicken in their life, and they'll perform better. But in all seriousness, we're opening our first new store in Chesapeake, and then knock on wood, we're going to keep helping corporate expand the brand, hopefully to the Midwest. So Cleveland, Ohio, in the future, we'll hopefully see some Bojangle signs hanging from the side of the freeway. I would ask, actually, more importantly, we're continuing to support Beat the Streets, and as many know, I was part of Beat the Streets in New York. I'm a big believer. I was very fortunate to get a lot of support. I wasn't necessarily a big believer in just handouts in life, because I think what I was given were tools. I think wrestling is a tool. I think judo's a tool. You could arguably look at things like religion and other things as a tool or as a guide to life. But if you just give people stuff, that's not going to help them learn themselves. So, Beat the Streets is a tool that we continue to share with the community and with kids. Being back in Cleveland and spending a lot of time here, I went to my first Beat the Streets practice on Wednesday night. The guys there at Beat the Streets Cleveland are doing an amazing job. I mean, they went from, we officially launched them at NCAA's, and it was really cool because it was in Cleveland. I got to make Mike Novogratz allowed me to make the announcement of the official opening of Cleveland Beat the Streets. They had been working on it for a while previous to that, but
Alec McClendon is a Penn grad.
That's right. Alec McClendon is a Penn grad, and they've seen one of the fastest growing programs in the history of Beat the Streets programs. I mean, just inside of that 3 years, I mean, we're talking, hundreds up to upwards of 1,000 kids that come through the program already. And, I would ask that if you have a local Beat the Streets program, get in contact with them, help them. And it's about, to me, it's about paying it forward, right? Yeah, Ben doesn't expect me to give him anything back, right? He paid it forward to me. I pay it forward to the younger kids at St. Ed's, and I pay it forward to the kids who beat the streets. So if you can support your local Beat the Streets programs, the gala's coming up actually in the summertime. We're actually going to host the Final X. It's going to be in Newark at the Prudential Center, which is going to be really cool. So, it gives access to all these kids to come and watch, Olympic level wrestling. And mind you, there's going to be at least, 2, hopefully 3 level world or Olympic champions per weight class that are going to be wrestling, especially in those middleweight classes. So definitely get out there and check that out. But yes, support your kids to get to Beat the Streets. And I promise you it'll change your lives.
Excellent. I'll be over there for that. And one of the recurring themes we've had in this show has been making sure you get around good people, get around great people, preferably. And we're around 2 of the greats right here, the great Yoshi Nakamura and Ben Hatta. So thank you very much for joining us. Make sure you support your local Beat the Streets, all Beat the Streets, and make sure you support Ben's films. We want to grow wrestling together, and that's how we do it as a family. And also a big shout out to Penn Wrestling, the Penn ecosystem, Coach Roger Rain and company. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Have a great